Welcome back to the conversation, everybody. When I put out my first video, I'm going to be honest, I did it just as a, something to do on an afternoon, and I enjoyed doing it. I did not expect the warm reception that I received. So in the comments section, quite a few people asked if I would consider doing an episode by episode breakdown. As I said in my first video, so many YouTubers out there have done a very good job of breaking down these episodes that I don't really want to walk in the same path that they've walked because they did a good job doing it. So I'll just, do these reviews my own way. And one of the ways that I'm going to do it is I want to talk about certain things inside of each episode. Good screenwriters, when they introduce their characters, tell us an awful lot about the characters without actually telling us anything. You know the old adage, show, don't tell. And that's one of the things that I particularly like about the first episode is the opening scene is the young prince staring at himself in a mirror. And we, the viewer, get to see that he's beat up pretty badly. Bruises, cut, a couple drops of blood. Does not look like he's in good shape. And if we look at his expression, it looks like he is, self-evaluating, asking the question that probably a hell of a lot of us have asked at one point in our lives. How the hell did I get here? And that's what I'm getting out of this. So, of course, the question is, how did he get here? What we learn about the young prince is we have the queen, the crown prince, and then Wilhelm. So he's technically second in line to the throne. He becomes the spare heir, so to speak. And he doesn't, I don't believe, have any particular royal duties at this time, and he doesn't seem to be all that interested in court life, not as much as his mother or his brother. And what we learn is that he was able to go to public school, unlike his brother, his mother, and probably his grandfather before him, who all went to an elite boarding school. This young man was allowed to go to public school, and we see that the influence of the friends he met there, he ends up inside of a nightclub, ends up in a fight, creates a scandal. When the crown finds out that he's been in a scandal, they send a car to pick him up, and in the car we find out that he has been told that the decision has been made that he's going to apologize to the nation and that he's going to attend the same boarding school that his brother, his mother, and his grandfather attended. He's upset by this, of course, because he didn't have any say in the matter. And that seems to be the theme here. He doesn't seem to have a say in anything. He gets back to the castle. He tries to discuss it with his mother. She doesn't want to hear it. She brushes him off. Important here also is when he, from stress, begins to bite his fingernails, and his mother slaps his hand away from his face, which is invading his personal space. Let's keep that in mind for a moment. We then move on to the scene where the royal family is coming into this large room where they're going to televise this apology, and we see that he tries to sit next to his father away from his mother, but someone from the press corps steps in and says, no, how about you move over and sit next to your mother? So he's being told where to sit. We go to the arrival of him at the school, and we see that he's met by his cousin and the house mistress, driven by his brother, by the way. And when he arrives there, the first thing his cousin does is reaches over and touches his face. Another invasion of his personal space. Keeping in mind that he is a member, an intimate member of the royal family. I think generally people aren't supposed to be touching their faces. And that's exactly what August, the cousin, does. And I'll discuss that more in just a moment. We see then that he tries to hold his suitcase during a press photo, and his cousin won't let him. It's a prop for him, I guess. And Wilhelm is not allowed to take possession of his own suitcase. That says something else about him. During this photo session, we see someone from the press corps telling Wilhelm to smile. So he's being told when to smile. We go further into the school where he meets the rest of the staff, and he poses for a photograph with the headmistress, and he stands to one side. Someone from the press corps steps in and says, no, could you stand on the other side? So again, he's being told where to stand. And that's a theme we get with this young man. He's told where he can go to school. He's told who he can hang out with, where to stand, where to sit, when to smile. How much control does this young man have over his own life? And when you consider the fact that the cousin touches his face, later wraps an arm around him, and his mother slaps his hand away from his face, it doesn't even seem that he has control over the space directly around him physically. And so we get the sense that the 16-year-old kid has no control over his own life, and that's exactly how he's viewing his life. After the choir is finished, and they're finished with their presentations, there is again another photo shoot, of course, and then the crown prince escorts his brother to his room. And this is the first time we get to see the crown prince and Wilhelm interacting privately, intimately, with nobody else there. And this is the moment that Eric explains to the young prince what the situation really is. And he, because Wilhelm says, I don't know how I'm going to spend 3 years here. And Eric says, listen, just do what you're told. Just follow the rules and keep up appearances. That's what it's about, keeping up appearances. And he wraps it up by saying, the sooner you conform and get it together, the easier your life is going to be. And I believe at that moment, Eric is explaining the wishes of the court directly to Wilhelm. Keep up appearances, do what you're told, don't cause waves. The keeping up appearances is going to be critical in another episode. We're going to come back to that. At the end of the day, we see Wilhelm come into the dining hall of the school, and this is his first opportunity to interact with the other students. And I found this to be particularly interesting because he comes in and he's standing there and he's talking to these fellas, and he asks, hey, what are we supposed to be doing right now? What is the procedure for the evening? And one of the students sitting next to him says, well, after we eat, we have, like a study hour, a work session, and after that, everybody kind of hangs out and you can play games or whatever. And Wilhelm makes the comment, well, that sounds boring. And the others say, oh, yeah, that's boring. They chime right in. And this is a famous scene. I don't need to explain it to you. But at this point, Wilhelm explains to them, you don't have to tell me what I want to hear. You are entitled to your own opinions. And I find that particularly interesting coming from a prince who I don't think is allowed to have his own opinions. In fact, he's going to make a comment about that later. The final thing I want to address about Wilhelm is when the headmaster finally comes into this room, and he gives a brief welcome to the prince. Everyone lowers their heads and folds their hands. Most of them close their eyes for prayer. Wilhelm in the scene keeps his eyes open, and I think that might be a statement on how he views tradition/religion. I think that's going to play out in the future also. There are certain characteristics that I cannot help but notice in people. It's just, I don't know, something you learn. And one of the things that I learned is when I'm interviewing someone or speaking with them, when they feel the need to raise their eyebrows, widen their eyes, and lean in slightly to talk to me, I automatically assume that this person is a manipulator and a liar. Because this is what manipulators and liars do. Every time I've had someone try to lean in like that, they were trying to convince me of their innocence, or they were trying to convince me of some particular fact that ultimately turned out not to be true. So after 20, 30 years of doing this, I don't believe people that make that expression. So now let me put a portrait up on the screen, and this is what I mean. If we look at this particular man, before we know anything else about him, I already don't trust him, I already don't like him. And at this moment, you see that it is the headmistress and August who are the only people from the school who are standing in the courtyard to directly welcome Eric and Wilhelm. I don't think this was accidental, and of course it was planned by the crown, I'm sure. It's a photo op. But August clearly loves being seen by the entire school to be intimates with the crown prince and Prince Wilhelm. He's making a social statement, and he's kind of building up his own position. Now at this moment, we see a fella in the background come running up. His name's Alexander. You can see he was not invited into this conversation. He kind of intruded, forced himself into it. And you can see from August's expression that he's tolerating Alexander doing this. There's a reason. And that's because Alexander is August's lackey. When he came running up, I half expected to see a dog tail wagging behind him because that's exactly how he strikes me. So no sooner does August introduce Alexander, who comes from a wealthy family, but he just as quickly dismisses him and sends him to go get the luggage. That tells you, I think, an awful lot about how August sees the world. He is the ultimate puppet master, and everyone else are his servants and puppets. That is exactly how I see this man. So we next see that Wilhelm, August, and Eric are standing in front of the school for a photo op where August is holding the luggage from Wilhelm. Wilhelm tries to take his luggage back. August won't let him. I think what we have here is we have a little power struggle, and August is asserting his dominance and forces the young prince to back down. In another scene, you see August call Wilhelm over to the table to have him sit with him, and he wraps his arm around Wilhelm. Once again, I think a subtle act of domination. And then one more thing I'd like you to look at. Now, we haven't talked about Simon yet, but here's a quick scene, a photo of Simon, where August reaches up and ruffles his hair like he's petting a dog. I think all of these are indicators from the screenwriters and from the director that August is that dominating puppeteer or likes to see himself in that position. For the moment, I think that's what we need to know about August. The next person I would naturally talk about would be Simon, but I'm not going to talk so much about what I get out of his character. I'm going to let that demonstrate itself in just a moment. The thing I think we need to know up front is that he comes from a middle-class family and lives with his mother and his sister in the local town. He is estranged from his father. That's going to play a role later. I don't have any evidence that he is at the school on scholarship. I also don't have any evidence against that. I know that in my school and many other schools that are expensive, there's almost always at least one scholarship student there, and that seems to be Simon. You'll notice that he only appears in the dining hall during the midday meal. I mean, he's got to eat somewhere. But in all other mess hall scenes, he's not there, and that's because he's not a boarder at the school. So now let's talk about that popular scene where Wilhelm and Simon cross paths for the first time. This takes place in the chapel on the day that Wilhelm has arrived at the school, and the school has put together a little presentation for him and the Crown Prince. So as they enter, of course, August loves to be seen. He's looking around, making sure that everybody sees him. And they sit on the front row, Prince Eric, Wilhelm, and August. And this is another moment where I want to freeze the frame and show you this point of domination where, probably without intending to, the Crown Prince is in front of Wilhelm, even as they're sitting next to each other. Same thing with August. August is slightly in front of Wilhelm so that he's in the background. I think this is a subtlety that's given to us by the director. Really clever, really well done. So then the choir comes in, they take their places on the stage, and something I didn't know the first one or two times that I saw this, if you freeze this frame and look at the choir, now they've not yet begun to sing, you'll notice that every choir member is looking directly at the choir master except for Simon, who has already seen the young prince. So they start singing, and Simon begins to sing his solo. My impression is this is probably his first solo because he's singing with absolutely no confidence. He's more like a quiet church mouse chirping, if there's such a thing. And until one of the upperclassmen says something about him being so softly spoken, and how does he address the challenge by the upperclassmen? He doesn't scurry away like a mouse, but instead you can see him straighten his back and lean into the performance and belt it out, and he nails it. At that moment is when Wilhelm, I think, really noticed Simon for the first time. He glances over at Prince Eric to see if he's looking or not. Then he looks back at Simon, and then we get that famous smile. This is Wilhelm's first classroom experience with his classmates, and they're in some sort of political science discussion. And what they're discussing in the classroom is the difference between wealthy folks who evade paying taxes and poor folks who defraud the government for welfare. So either way, we're talking about welfare fraud, whether it's from the perspective of the rich or the perspective of the poor. What I find utterly fascinating in this scene is every time someone speaks up and voices an opinion, which at this point I guess is a political opinion, you can see Wilhelm turn and lock in on that person. And if you look at the expression on his face, he is intensely interested in what's being said. Every time somebody speaks, he turns, he looks, he pays attention. And it's Simon who speaks last. And when Simon expresses an opinion that is contrary to what the wealthy kids are saying, Wilhelm picked up on that, and we can see a change in Wilhelm. I think this is particularly important because in the next scene when they come to have lunch, we see Wilhelm looking at Simon, and you can almost see the wheels in his head turning. He might have liked Simon for physical looks, what I'll call style, but now he realizes that Simon has his own brain and his own opinions and is willing to speak them. Therefore, we have style and substance. And I think this is the moment that Wilhelm decided to speak to Simon. So he goes and he sits across the table from Simon, and he does something he has not done to this point in this episode. Every time someone has met Wilhelm, they have been introduced to him. This is the first instance when Wilhelm takes the initiative to introduce himself to somebody else. Now, that's got to be kind of awkward for Wilhelm. Yeah, he's 16, but he's probably the most famous 16-year-old in Sweden. Everybody knows who he is. So the fact that he's going out of his way to introduce himself to Simon, I think, is really rather sweet. And he uses the conversation from the classroom as the impetus to get the conversation started. He compliments Simon on his opinion. And then Simon says, well, if you agreed with me, why didn't you say something in class? And then Wilhelm makes that a crucial statement. Because I'm not allowed to have political opinions. So let's go back to what we said in the beginning about Wilhelm. This is a young man who's told when to stand, when to sit, where to stand, where to sit, when he can smile, when he can't smile, and what opinions he's allowed to have. He's back in that box. And yet he's looking at Simon. This is a kid who doesn't seem to be contained by a box. And I think Wilhelm is now hooked on Simon. So let's talk about the initiation at the end of this episode. I attended a private school, had a graduating class of 20, and we didn't have an initiation, and as far as I know, we didn't have a secret society. And with only 20 people in the class, if there was a secret society, I would have heard about it. But after looking at this initiation, I'm kind of glad we didn't have one at my school, because what we have is one of the most disgusting things I've ever seen. You've already seen the episode, so you know that these young men take a paper cup and everybody takes a turn spitting into it, and then they pass it to Wilhelm, and Wilhelm drinks the spit of all of these other kids. I'm going to assume that all the kids in this group did this same ritual at some point. But I had to ask myself, what is the point of doing this? I actually thought back to a case that I was involved in about 10 years ago where there was a Latin King gang member who was in prison who, completely contrary to the rules of their gang, was impregnating other prisoners, other male prisoners. And he believed that by putting his biological material, his babies, into these other men, that he owned them. He literally believed he possessed them. Okay, there's, shocker, spoiler alert, there are some really weird people in prison. That's all I'm saying. So I'm wondering if there's something similar going on here when they're all drinking their spit, because they are literally sharing one another's bloodlines. They are literally sharing biological material with one another, after which they all pledge to protect one another. The wealthy kids, the elite kids, pledge to support and protect the crown. Wilhelm, for his part, promises to protect the wealthy elites. I think that's exactly what goes on in secret societies. I think that's exactly what goes on in every major government. And I think that's what went on here. But what I find absolutely important here is that after Wilhelm drank their spit and he made this pledge, 5 minutes later he leaves this meeting, he leaves these people to go outside with the commoner that he really wants to spend time with. The commoner that we will later find out has his devotion, as opposed to these young people. Not the word I wanted to use. These young people. The only other thing I want to point out about this particular scene is that while sitting on the sofa next to August, Wilhelm hears August say, "You know, we could murder somebody and nobody would do anything about it. Nobody here would tell." Wilhelm scoffs and August doubles down. He says, "No, really." And I couldn't help but think of a famous American politician that I know that made a similar statement.
They say, I have the most loyal people. Did you ever see that? Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
Now let's talk about Felice and Sarah. For the moment, I'm going to address them briefly together, because I don't want to tell you that Felice is one of my favorite characters, if not my favorite character in this series. What we have in Felice is we have a young woman who is very intelligent, who is very well connected, who is very wealthy, who is very beautiful. She has everything that a princess should have. Now, the problem is she doesn't see it that way. She has everything there is to have, and yet she feels completely inadequate. And she makes the comment to her roommate that she wants to get with Prince Wilhelm because if they had babies, the babies would have titles. And then the roommate says, well, why not just get with August, who is interested in you and who is a member of the royal family? And she says, well, because his children won't have titles. So we see she's after that title. Why is that so important to her? Well, unfortunately at the moment, very similar to Wilhelm, she's living under the shadow of her very wealthy parents, particularly her mother. Her mother is attempting to relive her own life, and we see this all the time, through her daughter. Nothing unique in that. But what we see is Felice is buckling under the pressure because she's pretending to be good at equestrian riding. She's going through the hoops, so to speak, but in fact she's terrible at it, and she's lying to her parents about how good she is at it. However, look at Simon's sister, who is also a commoner, who I'm assuming also is there on scholarship. She rides so naturally, And she is so free in the things that she wants to say, unlike Felice. And I think Felice sees qualities in Sarah that she desperately wants. And while initially she's very disdainful of Sarah out of jealousy, I think that ultimately she really wants to be friendly with Sarah. I think she wants to be friends with Sarah. And I think that's going to shape the dynamic of their relationship. And of course, you've probably already seen the series. You already know how that develops or unfolds. But I really, really like that. And I'm going to go into their relationship in another video in more depth. Now, there's one important aspect of Felice's character in this episode that needs to be addressed, and in so doing, I am directly praising the screenwriters and the director for treating young women as equals, that treating young women in a realistic fashion. In the culture I come from, young ladies are almost always portrayed as innocent and so pure, and that they have no sexual interests whatsoever. It's always the males around them that are the predators onto these young women. And of course, women are almost always seen as prey. Well, I don't want to say bullshit, but I think that's bullshit. Because young women, just like young men, do have sexual needs and sexual urges. And I am praising the directors of this show for showing Felice with the photograph of Wilhelm while she's masturbating. They did not shy away from it, they did not blush it, and most importantly, they did not overemphasize it. I thought that scene was incredibly well done, and my hat goes off to them. Really, really well done. I couldn't help but wonder, as a human rights advocate, if this scene could have been produced and published in the United States. Because in this scene, we have a 16-year-old. In reality, she was 22 when it was being filmed, but a 16-year-old reaching inside her pants and clearly masturbating in front of the camera. Now, what this is a visual depiction of a minor, according to American law, engaged in a sex act, and recorded for purposes of production. That is a classic definition of child pornography in the United States. And yet here in Europe, we don't think anything about it. We publish this because that's just the way the real world works. Now, there's another aspect of female sexuality that I'm going to address in the next episode. I thought it was in this episode, but it wasn't. Apparently, it's in the next one. And again, I just think this is a realistic portrayal of young women without being smutty. Really well done. So that is my personal take on Season 1, Episode 1 of Young Royals. I hope it was unique to you. I hope maybe I showed you some things that you hadn't noticed before and maybe can get a conversation started. By all means, I would love to hear from you. I do read every single comment that goes into the comment section. Even if I don't respond, I promise to you, every single one of them is important to me. So please share your thoughts with me. If you agreed with me, if you disagreed with me, if you think I missed something, or if there's something you'd like me to address, please put it in the comment section. I will be happy to read it, and I really would appreciate it if you gave us a thumbs up. There's an awful lot of effort that went into this video. Until next time, my friends, when we rejoin the conversation, take care of each other. Cheers.